What do you call it when a bunch of companies collude to set prices, fix markets, close off competition, capture regulators, and bribe politicians? we call it a cartel, right? Like the oil cartel. You've heard that term before, cartel? Who here has heard the term banking cartel? Oh, we don't hear that term. We don't talk about the banking cartel. We don't talk about the information cartel, right? How many of you here in Seattle work for one of the information cartel companies? Big smile on the box. Cartels are most insidious when we don't talk about them, when they hide in the shadows but in plain view. The banking system, payments, finance, are the biggest cartel in the world, and nobody calls them a cartel because they're the biggest cartel in the world. So they own all of the media, newspaper, channels, politicians, and laws. And that makes it very easy for them to get away with crimes. In fact, mega crimes. Just after the crisis in 2008, instead of some bankers going to jail, what happened was that they set up an additional layer of crime through a series of fraudulent foreclosures, robo-signing. Do you remember that crisis? One of the lead companies in that space, the biggest robo-signer of all, was run by a guy called Steve Mnuchin. Anybody know what that guy does today? He's the Treasury Secretary. And apparently he can do that job without running it from a jail cell. He copped a deal, didn't have to accept any wrongdoing, and then quickly got a cozy job where now he has the ultimate level of protection, which is qualified immunity. And that's how cartels work, because first they capture the market, then they capture the regulator, who is always, of course, about consumer protection. And the regulator is there to protect against evil things happening, like, for example, money laundering, if you don't have a banking license. If you don't have a banking license, no money laundering for you. But if you do have a banking license, well, I mean, we have to protect the system. So there'll be a fine. Usually the fine will be less than what you made actually money laundering. And you'll get away with it, right? And of course, we don't want to see any financing of terrorists, except for the ones we do through the State Department, the CIA, or the banks, in which case those are good people. So we have the regulators, and they're captured. And what that kind of situation does is it encourages behaviors that are fundamentally parasitic. So when capitalism fails in this particular mode, when you end up with full-blown crony capitalism, also known as kleptocracy. Kleptocracy is from the Greek word klepto, which means thief, and kratos, which means authority. So the thieves are in power, literally, that's kleptocracy. And what happens when you have a kleptocracy is that the most parasitic behaviors get rewarded. So it's actually not about competing. When you run business at that scale, it's not about competing. What it is about is finding the biggest pipe of money, the biggest flow of money in the economy, straddling that pipe, sticking a straw in it, and sucking as much of that money out as you can. So you can establish yourself as a parasitic leech on a flow of money, which pretty much describes the entire banking, financial, and payment system. The idea is you find a job that requires an intermediary. And the reason it requires an intermediary is because you've made sure that you've bought some lawyers and some Congress people to write a law that makes it require an intermediary, specifically you. And then you stick a straw into that flow of money and you start extracting rents. It's called rent-seeking behavior. So you take, half a percentage point here, half a percentage point there. We have this wonderful thing called fractional reserve banking, which if you tried to describe to a 5-year-old, they'd probably turn around and say, hang on, that sounds like a fraud. And they would be right. But of course, there's a big difference between fraud and something that's legal. And that depends on which politicians you can buy to make sure you make it legal. So we have these parasitic companies, and they sit on top of these flows of money, and they extract rent. They create this rent-seeking behavior. And in doing so, what they do is they disrupt competition. They make sure that no one can compete. And they disrupt competition by buying competitors, by suing competitors, or even better, by making sure that competitors can't keep up with regulation by capturing regulators and making sure that the competition is kept at bay. And doing that, they build a cartel. Then they make sure nobody calls it a cartel. Instead, we call it the shining example of American capitalism. And the end result of this would be appalling in its own self, right? I mean, obviously, this is not a good model to run an economy. It's not a competitive model to run an economy. But who does it really hurt? Does it really matter if a bunch of people get obscenely rich without having to compete with others? Does it really matter? Well, to most people in a semi-functioning, thriving economy, it doesn't matter. And that's the magic, because until money breaks, part of the benefit of freedom, the premium of liberty, is the ability to not give a shit about how any of it works. You don't need to worry about these details. You live in a free country. You're free to instead pay attention to Sunday football and enjoy your life and have another hot dog. But when money stops working, suddenly all of it comes crashing back, and you have to start learning some new vocabulary. And suddenly, at some point at the end of 2008, we all have to start learning new vocabulary. Grandma, what is a credit default swap? I don't know. Let's ask Uncle John. He has a degree in finance. He doesn't know either. Half the people in the business didn't know what a credit default swap was, or how it worked, and what was hiding behind it. And suddenly, everybody needs to know what a credit default swap is, because apparently it chewed a giant hole right in the middle of the economy. When money stops working, everything stops working, and suddenly you're on a crash course to learn about whose fault it was. And there are two alternative histories. In one of these histories, there was some oopsies. Some things happened. Some people made some mistakes. Some bad mistakes, but you know, they're just people trying to do their job. And in the end, it was mostly the fault of greedy homeowners who didn't read the fine print carefully enough to realize that they were buying a ballooning interest rate and had the audacity to want to own a home. So because of these greedy people, the real estate market had an oopsie. But don't worry, because you know, the irresponsible people had their homes taken away from them. The banks got some cash infusions, which we don't want to talk about too much, but everything was fixed, and we passed some laws, and it's not going to happen again. And really, it was just a blip. And then the next 10 years, we just rebuild everything, and everybody's happy, and now we have a roaring economy that's working great. That's story number one. Story number two, which may be familiar to more of you who are probably more in the middle class, is they robbed us blind, they stripped mine the entire economy, they had an orgy of fraud in which they knew exactly what they were doing, because there are mountains and mountains and mountains of evidence that the least competent RICO lawyer could use to unravel the entire thing and send 500 people to jail for 25 years. And all of that was ignored because we had to save the system, otherwise the system would crush us all. So we dumped more than $10 trillion in an orgy of quantitative easing into the banks, which they did not use to stimulate any part of the economy, but instead to blow another giant bubble into real estate, a giant bubble into the stock market, a giant bubble into bonds, into student loans, into subprime auto, into every part of the economy, while at the same time They made sure that those cops out there beat the shit out of anyone who had the audacity to go out and protest as part of Occupy Wall Street. And that didn't work. And they turned protest into a crime. And in that orgy of crime, they didn't just damage the economy. They raped the rule of law in this country and destroyed the justice system so they could get away with it. And we come full circle today, 10 years later, and where are we? $10 trillion in debt, 10 more giant bubbles, and it's gonna happen again. Because a system like that is fragile, because a system like that is corrupt. And it's not just corrupt, but it's architected in such a way as to reward and encourage that kind of behavior. In a system of incentives, if when you commit a crime, the penalty is less than the profits you made committing the crime, that is legal immunity. That is a very, very loud signal in a system of capitalism that says, do it again, only this time, leverage more. We could probably squeeze out another 10 years. Now, a lot of solutions have been proposed to this, because the problem with destroying institutions within a society is that many people who are then functionally destroyed, whose livelihood gets destroyed, rage, and that rage gets misdirected. It's the old adage of the really rich guy having 99 cookies, the middle class having 1 cookie, and the rich guy going, watch it, that brown guy's going to take your cookie. And that's the oldest trick in the game. I'll just give you one little piece of information. One of the houses stolen by Steve Mnuchin's robo-signing firm belonged to the guy, and I won't name him because they don't deserve to be named, who sent 17 bombs to Democratic Congress people just about a couple of weeks ago. That guy got robo-closed by Steve Mnuchin and decided to turn his rage against immigrants, gays, and Democrats for I don't know what. But the point being is that when you have that kind of destruction in a society, when you destroy the institutions of the rule of law and you create rage among people, they don't know where to turn. And what you have is violence and extremism, bigotry, hatred, and a desperate desire to find someone to blame. And of course, you can't really blame those guys because they're behind very tall walls and they have very good security. And guillotines are out of fashion. So they tried that in France, but can't do it again because we're now a civilized country. So what do you do? Protests. Okay, well, that ends in an orgy of violence by a militarized police, which is doing exactly what police have always done. You can't do that. Occupy, that was tried. Again, orgy of violence. Apathy. A lot of young voters tried apathy. They're like, I don't give a shit. These old people fucked it up. I'm just going to go and play my game and ignore all of this. That doesn't work out very well. Trying to become part of the parasitic class by somehow scrambling and clawing your way to just escape the middle class. Well, the problem is there's a tide of shit coming up behind you and it's moving faster than you are. The middle class is actually sliding backwards so fast that while you're trying to scramble out of it, you're really backsliding, so that doesn't work. How do we fix this problem? The first thing we need to do is identify why this keeps happening. And in my opinion, looking at this from a technology perspective, I think it's a problem of architecture. And the architecture that's the core of this problem is an architecture of hierarchy and centralization. Centralization is responsible for this. Parasitic behavior gets rewarded because there are giant centralized flows of money that someone can go and tap in. Because we've taken the traditional model of commerce where you visit your local butcher and you interact with them and you get something and you give something and you trade with other people around you in your community, a system of peer-to-peer commerce, if you like, and we've converted it into a system that I call a peer-to-corporation to corporation to corporation to corporation to peer system, whereby when I pay my butcher, Visa, Chase, and 3 other banks get involved, and they all stick a little straw in that flow so that by the time it reaches my butcher, a lot less money has arrived in their place. And I mean, how can you make a system like that work? It's absurd. You'd have to create a sense of apathy combined with the extreme convenience of waving a piece of plastic, and at the same time create some kind of dark cloud over cash, terrorists, and pretend that cash is something that we should get rid of because people use it to evade taxes. Of course, the people who evade taxes use corporations and very expensive lawyers to do that and actually get away with it. But the butcher might evade some taxes if we use cash, so we'll eradicate cash. That hierarchy is not just poisonous for the system of commerce that we have. It's not just our banking system that becomes a haven for parasites, because the very architecture itself concentrates power and creates a reward system for parasitic behavior. This is now happening with information cartels. Let's take everybody's identity, put it in a big pot, put Mark Zuckerberg on top, and oh, oops, we fucked up our electoral system. But we got cat videos, but hey, democracy is like, but we got cat videos, so that's okay, is it? And so the information cartels, the payment cartels, the electoral system that's so centralized that the Secretary of State of Georgia can run in his own election and then steal it at the same time, because we have electronic voting machines that make it so quick that you can count the votes incorrectly in an hour instead of counting them correctly over 3 days. So we have convenience, because now you can tap on the screen and you tap and vote, and the system changes your vote to something else, and it's counted instantly. Convenience. And democracy dies a little. We have the liberty to ignore most of these remote side effects, these negatives that arise out of centralization, because in this country we have an incredible amount of economic momentum and a dirty deal with the Saudis to sell oil only for dollars that ensures that we will continue to have low interest rates and the rest of the world will buy treasuries, and we can maintain a lifestyle of convenience. That illusion that this will continue to work like this allows us to accept this behavior and not try too hard to change it. We're not in a panic. It's not an emergency. It was in 2008, but that got fixed. Don't worry. It's not going to happen again in 2019. Don't worry. And it won't happen 3 times bigger because we didn't actually fix anything and the same symptoms still exist. Don't worry. Well, while you're not worrying, someone in Argentina is worrying because their currency just crashed 45% this year, because they're experiencing that in an accelerated fashion in an environment where they can't simply outsource their debt to the rest of the world in exchange for oil and war. So they actually suffer the consequences immediately, and it's happening in Venezuela, and it's happening in Brazil again, and it's happening in Turkey, and it's happening in Ukraine, and it's happening in dozens of other countries. And until now, in all of these countries, the problem was that when your esteemed leader tells you that the reason your currency is crashing and your economy is dying is not the systemic corruption throughout the entire system, the parasitic behavior of hierarchies sucking off the middle class and feasting on the carcass of the economy, it's actually the foreigners in Bolivia next door who are sabotaging us, or some other external threat. Well, not only is it your patriotic duty to use the currency, but it's also your patriotic duty to not leave the country. Which, of course, refugees do all the time because they're not so patriotic. And so, there's no exit. Because until 2008, there wasn't really an alternative. Holding dollars, for example, as a foreign currency, or hoarding gold, or putting it under your mattress, that's very easy for a government to stop, to break down, to censor. And they can do that by confiscating your gold and raiding your house. And if you are seen exchanging hard currency, like foreign currency, with others, you'll get shot. You won't just